Dreams in Egypt were never private. They were surveillance from the gods. Every Nile-born child grew up with this belief that when the body surrendered to night, the soul stepped into a theater where higher powers could whisper commands. This wasn't superstition on the fringes. It was state religion, woven into the way Egyptians saw the world. The Book of the Dead warned that dreams revealed truth, and truth was dangerous. What you dreamed could decide whether you rose in the social order or fell into suspicion. The most famous example stands in stone to this day, the dream stele of Thutmose Roman IV. Carved between the paws of the great Sphinx, it tells the story of a young prince who lay sleeping in the desert heat. In his dream, the Sphinx itself spoke, promising him kingship if he cleared the sands that buried its body. Thutmose awoke, obeyed, and became pharaoh. Was it divine will? Or was it propaganda carved into granite, a timeless reminder that power could be justified by what happened in the silence of sleep? This is where psychology enters. Modern researchers call it authority bias, the tendency to accept guidance from figures we believe are legitimate. In ancient Egypt, no figure was more legitimate than a god speaking through a dream. If pharaohs could convince the people that the gods had whispered their rise to power, resistance became unthinkable. It was not politics, it was destiny, and destiny cannot be debated. But there is another layer. The Egyptians didn't see dreams as chaotic fragments of the mind. They saw them as structured messages. Dream manuals, fragments of which survive on papyri, cataloged which visions meant fortune and which foretold ruin. A snake in a dream, it might mean the gods would bless you with protection. A broken vessel, misfortune was near. By classifying dreams, priests controlled interpretation, turning random flickers of the subconscious into a rigid system that always pointed back to Pharaoh's authority. Imagine the tension this created. On one hand, dreams were intimate, unfolding in the privacy of night. On the other, they were communal, because every dream could be questioned, decoded, or weaponized by priests. What you dreamed wasn't yours, it was Pharaoh's business. The very act of sleeping became a form of surveillance, your subconscious enlisted into the machinery of control. And here lies the darker truth. Pharaohs didn't need to forge every dream. They only needed to forge the belief that dreams mattered. The mind did the rest. Psychologists today call this suggestibility, when expectation shapes perception. If you expect a dream to carry divine weight, every shadow in sleep becomes a message, every vision a command. Fear and obedience took root not only in daylight, but in the unguarded hours of night, which raises a disturbing question. If pharaohs claimed even your dreams, what corner of your life was ever truly your own? The temples of Egypt were not built only for prayer. They were laboratories of the mind. Inside their stone walls, far from the noise of the markets, priests practiced one of the most unsettling arts of the ancient world, dream incubation. Worshippers seeking healing or guidance would sleep within sacred chambers, surrounded by incense smoke so thick it clung to their lungs. Chants hummed through the night, rhythmic, hypnotic, blurring the line between prayer and suggestion. Sleep was never natural here, it was engineered. The practice was especially tied to the cult of Imhotep, the deified architect and healer. Archaeological records show that those who came to his temples were prepared for nights of controlled dreaming, fasting during the day, lying on stone beds at night, waiting for divine visions. In these environments, the subconscious was primed, fragile, and easily influenced. If a priest whispered a phrase, or if the air was heavy with hallucinogenic herbs, the dreamer's visions would bend in predictable directions. What seemed like divine revelation was, in truth, psychological conditioning. The Greeks would later inherit this practice in the temples of Serapis, where dream incubation was used as a tool of both healing and control. But in Egypt, its political purpose was clear. A farmer might enter the temple desperate for answers, only to awaken with a dream that just happened to affirm Pharaoh's divine mandate or reinforce obedience to the state. Was it coincidence or choreography? The lines were intentionally blurred. Modern psychology helps us see what was happening. Sleep researchers describe this as suggestibility in hypnagogic states, the heightened openness of the mind as it drifts between waking and dreaming. In this vulnerable window, belief is pliable, and identity itself can be reshaped. Priests were not only healers, they were gatekeepers of this fragile threshold, able to seed images that would later bloom as divine truth in the minds of the faithful. The emotional effect was profound. Imagine waking from a night in the temple, still tasting incense in your mouth, your heart racing from a vivid dream in which a god pointed toward the pharaoh. How could you ever doubt it? The vision wasn't external, it came from within your own mind. That is the brilliance of this manipulation. Resistance collapses when obedience feels self-generated. The dreamer believes they have received a personal revelation, when in reality, it has been carefully staged. This reveals the terrifying contrast at the heart of dream incubation. To the devotee, the temple was a sanctuary where God spoke in whispers of comfort. To the ruler, it was a stage where obedience was rehearsed in the language of dreams. One side saw hope, the other saw control. And once this mechanism took root, pharaohs had a tool more powerful than armies. Steel can command bodies, but dreams command souls. Citizens did not just obey laws, they obeyed the visions that seemed to come from their own unconscious. The temples had transformed sleep, the last refuge of privacy, into an extension of the state. The whispers of priests may have been soft, but their echoes shaped empires. Not every dream was welcome in Pharaoh's Egypt. Some were too dangerous to be allowed. When a dream suggested disobedience, rebellion, or doubt, priests dismissed it as the work of malevolent forces. But when a dream reinforced Pharaoh's authority, it was elevated, announced, and carved into memory. This was no accident, it was strategy. By filtering which dreams were valid and which were false, pharaohs turned the subconscious into a rigged game where every outcome pointed back to their divine right. One of the most revealing artifacts is Papyrus Chester Beatty Roman III, dated to around 1200 BCE. It is among the earliest known dream manuals, meticulously cataloging which images were considered good omens and which were bad. To dream of drinking beer, a favorable sign. To dream of losing teeth, an omen of disaster. But the deeper message was this: only the state could decide the meaning of your dream. The manual itself functioned as a political instrument, teaching citizens that the unseen world was mapped, ordered, and interpreted under Pharaoh's control. Modern psychology calls this framing, the way authority can shape interpretation of ambiguous events. Dreams are, by nature, chaotic. But when priests declared that a dream meant fortune or ruin, they imposed structure, bending randomness into a tool of power. In doing so, they stripped citizens of the ability to interpret their own subconscious. A man might wake troubled by a vision of Pharaoh's downfall, but if the priests labeled it evil, it carried no weight. Meanwhile, a dream of Pharaoh's triumph would be broadcast as divine confirmation, a prophecy fulfilled before the fact. The contrast was devastating. To the people, dreams felt intimate, personal, flashes of their deepest fears and hopes. To the state, dreams were public property, sorted into categories that always reinforced Pharaoh's supremacy. What should have been private imagination became propaganda, stamped with divine approval or dismissal. The subconscious had been nationalized. And the effect went beyond belief. By amplifying favorable dreams, pharaohs staged a kind of subconscious theater on a societal scale. Citizens did not simply obey out of fear, they obeyed because they thought the gods themselves had spoken. It was the psychology of confirmation bias centuries before the term existed. People remembered only the dreams that reinforced Pharaoh's authority, while those that undermined him were forgotten, erased, or condemned. The message was clear: even your own mind could betray you. Dreams that aligned with Pharaoh were sacred, those that didn't were treasonous. Night itself became a battlefield, and sleep, the last sanctuary of freedom, was carefully policed by the state. Nightmares in Egypt were not dismissed as random terrors. They were warnings, and pharaohs made sure the people knew it. Stories spread across villages of rebels who dreamt of defying Pharaoh, only to be struck by sickness the next day. Priests whispered of men who ignored their dreams, only to lose their families or their crops. These tales were not simply folklore. They were deterrents, seeded by a state that understood fear lingers longest when it comes from within. A sword can be avoided, but a nightmare, you carry that with you. Ancient texts reveal how this manipulation worked. In dream manuals like Papyrus Chester Beatty Roman 3, bad dreams were meticulously catalogued: seeing oneself dead, eating foul food, or being chased by shadows were omens of divine punishment. Such classifications gave priests the power to frame nightmares as cosmic judgments, and pharaohs turned this framing into a weapon. To doubt Pharaoh was to risk becoming the character in your own nightmare, marked for destruction by the gods. Modern psychology offers a chilling parallel. Researchers studying fear conditioning show that when traumatic imagery is paired with authority, it becomes seared into long-term memory. Just as Pavlov conditioned dogs with bells and food, rulers conditioned citizens with dreams and fear. A nightmare was no longer a passing horror. It became a lifelong reminder of Pharaoh's reach, a scar written in the mind. The brilliance of this system was its invisibility. No soldiers were needed to enforce obedience when people policed themselves through dread. A farmer who dreamt of defiance would wake shaken, interpret his vision as a curse, and return to submission without a word spoken by Pharaoh. Fear became internalized, woven into the quietest hours of sleep. Yet here lies the suffocating contrast. To the devout, nightmares confirmed the gods were watching, a terrifying sign of divine presence. To the state, they were tools of mass control, cheap and efficient, requiring nothing but whispers and imagination. The dreamer suffered alone, but the fear reinforced the collective. Each private nightmare was another thread in the net of obedience. And still, there was no escape. Even relief could be twisted into terror. If a dreamer awoke without nightmares, priests might say it was only because Pharaoh's favor had spared them. Gratitude masked anxiety, but the fear never left. Tomorrow, the gods might withdraw their protection. Safety was always conditional, dangling like a blade above the sleeper's head. This weaponization of nightmares turned night itself into a prison. The stars above the Nile, once symbols of eternal order, became silent wardens. People no longer trusted their own subconscious. Every flicker of the imagination was judged, catalogued, and made to serve Pharaoh's throne. And that is the genius of psychological control. It doesn't require chains when terror plants itself in the mind. A nightmare can do what armies cannot: haunt a man in silence, in solitude, in the one place he thought he was safe. Pharaohs understood one timeless truth: people don't just believe what they're told. They believe what they see performed. In the great courts of Egypt, dreams were not whispered secrets. They were staged productions, retold in rituals and carved into monuments as if the gods themselves had written the script. What Pharaoh dreamed became what the people watched, and what the people watched became what they believed. Ramesses Roman II mastered this theater of dreams. After the Battle of Kadesh, one of history's earliest recorded clashes between superpowers, Ramesses inscribed grand accounts of his visions and divine guidance. In his version, Ammon, the king of gods, appeared to him in a dream promising victory against impossible odds. The reality of the battle was far less decisive, a bloody stalemate. But the inscriptions turned it into a dream fulfilled, a miracle of Pharaoh's divine favor. Citizens who raided the walls or heard the tales in temple recitations didn't see political spin, they saw prophecy. And prophecy doesn't need evidence. The psychology behind this was ingenious. By dramatizing dreams as living myths, pharaohs tapped into what modern researchers call narrative transportation, the human tendency to lose oneself in a story, suspending critical judgment. When citizens watched Pharaoh's dream enacted in ritual or retold in song, their skepticism dissolved. They weren't being lectured about loyalty. They were being immersed in a performance where loyalty was the only logical ending. The effect was hypnotic. Imagine standing in a temple, incense filling the air, as priests recited Pharaoh's dream aloud. The crowd gasps as the god speaks in the dream. The people nod as the vision promises Pharaoh's eternal rule. In that moment, you're not a skeptic. You're an audience member swept into a divine drama. And when the curtain falls, obedience feels less like submission and more like participation in a cosmic play. But the brilliance of Pharaoh's dream theater was its contrast. To the people, it was awe-inspiring confirmation that their ruler was chosen by gods. To the throne, it was stagecraft, careful editing of dreams to reinforce power, whether or not those dreams ever occurred. The truth of the dream was irrelevant. Its performance was everything. And once dreams became theater, they ceased to be private visions. They became public property, replayed and repeated until the people's own memories blurred. Was Ramesses guided by Ammon? Or had the story been told so often that it no longer mattered? Reality bowed to performance, and the performance always ended with Pharaoh in command. This was the genius of the system. Law could punish the body, but dreams on stage commanded the soul. Citizens didn't simply obey Pharaoh, they internalized his visions as their own. The line between ruler and ruled dissolved in ritual smoke. In ancient Egypt, even your dreams could be held against you. What began as private visions soon became public reports. Citizens who dreamt of strange omens or troubling symbols often shared them with priests, seeking reassurance or interpretation. But reassurance was not always what they received. Those reports were collected, analyzed, and sometimes whispered up the chain of power. A dream that hinted at disobedience or misfortune for Pharaoh could mark someone as suspicious, not for what they had done, but for what their own mind had revealed. This practice echoed through texts like Papyrus Chester Beatty Roman III, where dreams were carefully catalogued as good or bad. To dream of eating well was fortune. To dream of Pharaoh's weakness was doom. But the real danger wasn't the dream itself. It was who heard it. A farmer confiding to a priest that he dreamt Pharaoh would fall ill might suddenly find himself watched more closely, his loyalty questioned, his family living under a cloud of fear. The subconscious had become incriminating evidence. Psychologists today might call this a form of thought policing, centuries before Orwell ever named it. By demanding dream reports, the state extended surveillance into the one realm no guard could patrol, the human mind. The parallel to modern regimes is striking. Authoritarian states in the 20th century often demanded citizens denounce wrong thoughts or confess hidden doubts. In Egypt, the same principle existed, except the proof wasn't in pamphlets or speeches. It was in your dreams. The paranoia this created was suffocating. Imagine waking from a troubling vision, Pharaoh struck down, or gods turning their faces away and realizing you couldn't speak of it. Silence became the only defense. Yet silence itself could be dangerous, for priests might interpret your failure to share as concealment. Dreams, once a refuge of honesty, became traps. Whether you confessed them or withheld them, you were exposed, and that was the genius of this system. Pharaoh didn't need to read minds, he only needed to make people believe their minds were readable. The mere possibility that dreams could betray them was enough to enforce obedience. Citizens learned to censor themselves at the most intimate level, not only in speech but in sleep. The emotional contrast was devastating. To the believer, reporting dreams was an act of devotion, proof that the gods were close. To the state, it was surveillance data collection long before the term existed. What looked like piety was in fact intrusion, a slow erasure of the boundary between private thought and public loyalty. And the ultimate lesson was chilling. If your dreams could condemn you, then nowhere was safe. Not your home, not your family, not even the silence of your own unconscious. Night itself had been conscripted into Pharaoh's watch. There are few terrors more universal than waking in the dark, unable to move with a crushing weight on your chest. Today, we call it sleep paralysis. In ancient Egypt, it was proof that the gods, or worse, the demons, had entered your chamber. Priests knew these episodes well. They listened as worshippers described the same sensations, the feeling of being pinned down, shadows hovering at the edge of vision, a suffocating dread that seemed to come from nowhere. Rather than dismiss these reports, the temples weaponized them. They told the afflicted that such encounters were not accidents of the body, but judgments of the divine. A benevolent God pressing upon you was a sign of blessing. A malevolent one was punishment for hidden disobedience. And either way, the message was clear. The supernatural was watching, even in your most helpless moments. Modern neuroscience explains these terrors differently. During sleep paralysis, the brain's REM cycle locks the body in place to prevent acting out dreams, while waking consciousness briefly intrudes. Hallucinations of figures, voices, or pressure are the brain's attempt to make sense of the paralysis. But to the Egyptians, with no framework for biology, these visions were evidence of the god's touch, and priests made sure the interpretation always led back to Pharaoh's authority. The psychological principle at play here is attribution theory, the human tendency to assign meaning to unexplained events. Faced with terrifying bodily experiences, people look for causes. The priests provided them, shaping raw fear into obedience. To suffer sleep paralysis was not simply to endure a nightmare, it was to receive a warning. And the interpretation of that warning rested entirely in the hands of the temple. The emotional impact was profound. Imagine waking from such an episode, your heart racing, your body still trembling. You stagger to the temple, confess the vision, and are told it was a sign of the gods testing your loyalty to Pharaoh. The fear you felt in the night becomes chained to political obedience. What science now reveals as a misfiring of the nervous system was, in Egypt, transformed into living proof that resistance invited divine punishment. The contrast was stark. To the afflicted, these episodes were moments of intimacy with the unseen, proof that gods and demons walked in the night. To the state, they were opportunities, perfectly timed bursts of terror that priests could spin into lessons of loyalty. The body's natural vulnerability became Pharaoh's most persuasive ally, and so the boundary between science and sorcery blurred. Fear of the gods merged seamlessly with fear of the night, and in that overlap, power became absolute. Every empire learns the same truth: the tools that build power can also erode it. For the pharaohs, Dreams had been their invisible weapon, their divine script of authority. But in time, that script began to fray. During Egypt's late period, as foreign powers encroached and rival priesthoods rose, the monopoly on dreams began to dissolve. What had once been a seamless theater, where Pharaoh's visions were unquestioned and priests controlled interpretation, became a marketplace of competing narratives. The sacred silence of the dream temples was disrupted by new voices, new gods, and new methods of divination. One of the greatest disruptions came from Greece. When Greek influence seeped into Egypt after centuries of trade and conquest, it brought with it new traditions of dream incubation, particularly within the cults of Asclepius. The Greek approach was different. Dreams could still heal, still guide, but they were not tied exclusively to Pharaoh's authority. Ordinary people could claim divine visions without passing through the filter of the state. For the first time, dreams became plural, fractured, and open to rival interpretation. This pluralism weakened Pharaoh's grip. If a farmer could dream of serapes and interpret the vision without fear of punishment, what power did Pharaoh's dream theater still hold? What once bound society together in a single narrative now splintered into many. Dreams, once centralized and weaponized, slipped from the Pharaoh's hand like water through a sieve. The psychology of this unraveling is clear. Control depends on exclusivity. Psychologists studying propaganda note that once competing narratives emerge, belief begins to fracture. Citizens confronted with multiple interpretations start to doubt not only the new voices but the old ones too. Skepticism grows. And skepticism is poison to systems built on faith. The emotional contrast was striking. To the old guard, the rise of rival cults was chaos, a dangerous erosion of divine order. To the people, it was liberation, a chance to reclaim ownership of their own subconscious. What had once been a prison of dreams became, for some, an open field of competing truths. Pharaoh's visions no longer held the final word. They were one story among many, but this unraveling carried its own dangers. In a world where every dream could be claimed as divine, the very concept of revelation was cheapened. What once inspired awe began to inspire doubt. The grand inscriptions of Ramesses Roman II declaring divine guidance now seemed like theater. Perhaps they always had. And when the audience begins to suspect the play is staged, the illusion collapses. By the Ptolemaic period, when Greek rulers sat upon Egypt's throne, the dream temples that once served pharaohs had largely lost their monopoly. Dreams had not disappeared. People still sought visions in sleep, still clung to symbols of hope and fear, but the system pharaohs perfected no longer belonged to them. Their most sinister tool of control had slipped away, leaving behind echoes carved in stone and papyri that no longer carried the same authority. And yet, even in decline, the brilliance of their system remains haunting. For centuries, pharaohs ruled not only through armies and monuments, but through the subconscious of their people. Their failure was not that they used dreams, but that they could not keep them. The dream temples are ruins now. The incense has long since faded. The priests are gone, their chants swallowed by sand. But the weapon pharaohs forged did not die with them. It simply changed its costume. In the modern world, dreams are no longer confined to sleep. They are projected onto screens, whispered through advertising, encoded in the symbols of propaganda. Governments, corporations, and ideologues still understand what pharaohs once mastered. If you can shape the images in a person's mind, you can shape their reality. Ancient Egypt did it with divine omens. Today it is done with news cycles, subliminal cues, and psychological operations. The parallels are chilling. Where priests once declared which dreams were good or bad, media empires now frame which narratives are noble and which are dangerous. Where Pharaoh's temples once staged dreams as public theater, modern powers stage televised trials, political rallies, and social spectacles. And where nightmares once served as warnings against rebellion, today fear is still deployed through headlines, alerts, and curated crises that keep populations obedient. The dream theater of Ramesses has become the dream theater of 24-hour news. Psychology explains why the pattern endures. Framing, confirmation bias, fear conditioning, and narrative transportation, the same principles pharaohs intuitively wielded, remain the foundations of modern influence. When a society is told the same story again and again, it doesn't matter whether the story is fully true. What matters is that it is immersive, repeated, and emotionally charged. Belief bends to performance, just as it did in the temples along the Nile. But there is a deeper unease here. Unlike the Egyptians, we imagine ourselves free from superstition. We laugh at the thought of citizens bowing to dream manuals and omens. Yet are we so different? Do we not still let external powers dictate the meaning of our fears, our hopes, our visions for the future? The manipulation is less visible now, more polished. But it follows the same architecture: seed the image, frame the interpretation, control the conclusion. The contrast is haunting. Pharaohs commanded belief by claiming the gods spoke in dreams. Today, leaders and advertisers command belief by claiming data, experts, or algorithms speak in truths. One used the terror of the night, the other uses the illusion of constant daylight. Both aim for the same end, to colonize the inner world of the human mind. And so we are left with the same unsettling question the Egyptians once faced: are our thoughts truly our own, or are we still dreaming someone else's dream? The temples have collapsed, but the stage remains. The scripts are new, but the performance is familiar. The pharaoh's shadow stretches further than his monuments, lingering not in stone but in the subtle psychology of influence. The lesson is not despair but awareness. To recognize manipulation is the first act of resistance. The pharaohs may be dust, their empires reduced to sand and relics, but the empire of the mind they built has never fallen asleep.